The bells of Krampus knocked. It was a bitterly cold December evening when Clara first noticed the strange footprints in the snow. The small town of Grendel Hollow was tucked deep in a pine forest, a quaint place where winters were long and nights were even longer. Clara had just locked up the bakery where she worked, her boots crunching through the fresh snowfall as she began the short walk home. She stopped abruptly when she saw them, enormous hoofprints leading away from the main street and into the dense forest. They weren't animal tracks. These were unnervingly large and deep, like they had been made by something much heavier than a deer. They curved oddly, one step digging deep, the other a strange, scraping drag, as if whatever had made them limped or dragged a heavy burden. Clara hesitated, glancing around. The streets were empty, most townsfolk huddled in their warm homes, preparing for the coming holiday. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, but the cheerful glow only made the dark spaces between buildings seem more sinister. Probably a prank, she muttered to herself, though the uneasy feeling in her stomach refused to settle. She hurried home, ignoring the faint tinkling of bells that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in the woods. By the next morning, the whole town was buzzing. "Did you see the footprints?" whispered Mrs. Egerton, the elderly librarian, as Clara stopped by to return a book. "Something strange is in the woods. Mark my words." Others nodded in agreement. The tracks weren't limited to the bakery. They had been spotted near the church, the school, and even outside a few homes. "Maybe it's a wild animal," offered Mr. Gable, the butcher, though his tone lacked conviction. "Wolves have been spotted near here before." Clara said nothing, but her unease grew. She knew wolves didn't leave tracks like that. And what about the bells she'd heard? They hadn't sounded like anything a wild animal would carry. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the frost-covered window. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but beneath it, she thought she heard something else. A faint jingle. The sound was soft at first, almost like wind chimes, but it grew louder, sharper, and more insistent. She sat up, heart pounding, and tiptoed to the window. The moonlight illuminated the snowy street below, and for a moment, Clara saw nothing unusual. But then, in the distance, a shadow moved. At first she thought it was a man, but the figure was too tall, too hunched. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and deliberate. As it stepped into the moonlight, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was cloaked in ragged black fur, and heavy chains draped across its shoulders, jingling with every movement. Thick, curling horns rose from its head, and its glowing eyes pierced the darkness. In one clawed hand, it held a long staff, crooked at the top like a shepherd's crook, and in the other, a large sack that wriggled and squirmed as though something alive were trapped inside. The figure paused, sniffing the air, before dragging the sack behind it and disappearing into the shadows. Clara stumbled back from the window, trembling. She had heard the old stories, tales whispered by her grandmother about Krampus, the dark companion of St. Nicholas. Unlike the jolly saint who brought gifts to good children, Krampus came for the wicked, punishing them with birch rods or carrying them away in his sack. But those were just stories, weren't they? By the next morning, the town was in an uproar. A boy had gone missing. "Little Toby," said Mrs. Egerton, her voice trembling. "He never came home last night." His parents were frantic, and search parties were quickly formed. Clara joined one, her heart heavy with dread. As they scoured the woods, the strange hoofprints appeared again, leading deeper and deeper into the forest. The search party hesitated. The woods were dark and treacherous, the snow masking hidden dangers. "Perhaps we should wait for the sheriff," someone suggested, but Clara shook her head. "There's no time. Toby could be in danger." She didn't mention the figure she had seen the night before, but the image of the writhing sack haunted her. She plunged into the forest, the others reluctantly following. As they ventured deeper, the trees grew taller and more oppressive, their branches twisting together to block out the light. The jingling of bells began again, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. "Do you hear that?" whispered one of the men, his voice shaky. Before anyone could respond, a terrible scream echoed through the woods. It was high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the cold air like a blade. "Over there," Clara shouted, running toward the sound. They burst into a small clearing, and for a moment, no one moved. In the center of the clearing stood a twisted pine tree, its branches decorated not with ornaments, but with bones. Animal skulls, rib cages, and femurs hung like grotesque baubles, swaying gently in the wind. At the base of the tree lay the body of a man, one of the other search party members who had wandered ahead. His eyes were wide open, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Clara's stomach churned as she noticed deep gashes across his chest, the wounds too precise to be made by any wild animal. "Let's go back," someone whimpered. But before they could retreat, the bells jingled again, louder and closer. And then it appeared. Krampus. It towered over them, its horns scraping the branches above. Its sack wriggled violently, muffled cries escaping from within. Its glowing eyes scanned the group, and it let out a guttural growl. "Run!" Clara screamed. The group scattered, fleeing in all directions. Clara sprinted through the woods, her heart pounding as the jingling bells chased her. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it, its heavy footsteps and the dragging of the sack. She tripped on a root, falling face first into the snow. Rolling onto her back, she finally saw it. Krampus loomed over her, its clawed hand reaching out. "No!" she screamed, kicking wildly. Her foot connected with its knee, and it stumbled just long enough for her to scramble to her feet and keep running. By the time Clara made it back to the village, she was alone. The others were either lost in the woods or worse. She banged on doors, shouting for help, but the townsfolk were too terrified to act. "Barricade your doors," warned the mayor, his face pale. "It's Krampusnacht. We must endure until dawn." The hours crawled by. Clara sat huddled in her home, every creak of the floorboards and gust of wind setting her nerves on edge. She tried to convince herself it was over, that the monster wouldn't return, but deep down she knew better. Around midnight, the bells began again. She peered out the window, and there it was, standing in the middle of the street. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and it began to approach. Clara grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a cast-iron skillet, and stood her ground. The door burst open, and Krampus stepped inside. It was even more horrifying up close, its fur matted with blood, its claws glinting in the firelight. Clara swung the skillet with all her strength, striking it across the face. The beast roared, more in anger than pain, and swiped at her. Its claws tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm. She screamed, stumbling back as it advanced. Desperate, she grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and thrust it at the creature. Krampus hissed, recoiling from the flames. Seizing the moment, Clara ran outside, hoping to lure it away from the village. The chase led her back into the woods, the bells ringing incessantly. Clara's lungs burned, her legs trembling with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Finally, she stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive ancient tree. Its roots twisted up from the ground like grasping fingers, and at its base lay the remains of dozens of children, small shoes, toys, and tattered clothing scattered among the snow. Krampus emerged from the shadows, its sack writhing furiously. It opened the bag, and Clara's blood ran cold as she saw the terrified faces of the missing children inside. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The beast began to advance, but Clara noticed something. The roots of the tree were covered in strange, glowing symbols. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, telling stories of how Krampus could be banished with the right ritual. Desperate, she grabbed a sharp rock and began tracing the symbols into the snow, copying them as best she could. Krampus hesitated, its head tilting as if realizing what she was doing. It lunged at her, but she rolled out of the way, slashing at its leg with the rock. The beast howled, and Clara scrambled to complete the final symbol. As she finished, the ground beneath Krampus began to quake. The symbols glowed brighter, and the beast let out an unearthly scream as it was dragged toward the tree by invisible forces. "No more," Clara said, her voice trembling. "You won't take any more children." With a final roar, Krampus was pulled into the earth. the snow sealing over him as though he had never been there. By dawn, the children in the sack had been freed, though they were weak and traumatized. Clara led them back to the village, where their parents wept with relief. The hoofprints vanished after that night, and the bells were never heard again. But Clara knew better than to feel safe. Every December she lit a candle by her window and kept a fire burning through the night, a silent warning to the dark forest. Because some stories were true, and Krampus would always return for the wicked, and sometimes even for the brave. The workshop below. Every December, the residents of Snowpike would gather to celebrate Christmas with a week of festivals, parades, and holiday cheer. Nestled in a remote valley surrounded by towering pines and jagged peaks, the town had earned a reputation for being the most festive place in the country. Tourists flocked to see the massive Christmas tree in the town square, to taste Mrs. Harlow's famous peppermint fudge, and to experience the Enchanted Workshop, a sprawling display of animatronic elves, reindeer, and Santa Claus himself in the old Frost lumber mill. But the workshop wasn't just a show. It had been there long before Snowpike's tourism boom, and the locals whispered stories about its origins. Some said it was built on cursed ground, a place where something ancient and unspeakable had once been buried. Others spoke of strange disappearances over the years, children gone missing during the holidays, their names etched into local folklore but rarely spoken aloud. Elizabeth, a seasonal worker at the Enchanted Workshop, had heard the stories all her life. But to her, they were just silly tales to spook the tourists. On December 21st, Elizabeth arrived for her shift at the workshop. Snow fell in soft, silent flakes, covering the abandoned frost mill in a layer of pristine white. She bundled up, pulling her coat tighter as the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the workshop was alive with mechanical whirring and flashing lights. Rows of animatronic elves in green and red uniforms busily hammered toy replicas, stuffed fake teddy bears, and wrapped empty boxes in shiny paper. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, and holiday music played faintly through hidden speakers. The main attraction was Santa's throne, where children could sit and take pictures with the big man himself. The Santa this year was Mr. Hargrove, an elderly man who had played the role for decades. But this morning, Hargrove was nowhere to be seen. "Late again," muttered Elizabeth, glancing at her watch. She walked behind the throne to check the staff room, but the door was locked. Strange. Hargrove always left it open during shifts. "Probably out smoking," she said, heading back to the display floor. The elves stared at her as she passed, their glass eyes reflecting the twinkling lights strung across the ceiling. One of them, a mechanical elf with a hammer, creaked suddenly, its head swiveling toward her. She froze. It wasn't unusual for the animatronics to glitch, but this one, it felt intentional. The hammer in its hand tapped against the toy it was building, slower and harder than before, like a deliberate warning. Elizabeth shook her head. "Get a grip," she muttered, walking away. By the afternoon, the workshop was packed with visitors. Families lined up for photos with Santa, children pointed excitedly at the elves, and Elizabeth worked the register at the gift shop near the exit. "Have you seen Mr. Hargrove?" Elizabeth asked her co-worker Tony. "Nope," Tony said, scratching his chin. "Maybe he called out sick?" Elizabeth frowned. That didn't feel right. She decided to check the staff room again. The hallway leading to the back was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering sporadically. The door to the staff room was still locked, but now there was something else. A faint, rhythmic thumping coming from inside. Elizabeth pressed her ear to the door. "Mr. Hargrove," she called. No response, just the steady thump. She tried the handle again, but it wouldn't budge. Then she noticed it. Scratch marks on the wood near the bottom of the door, as though something had clawed at it. Elizabeth stepped back, her pulse quickening. As the day wore on, the workshop began to feel wrong. The animatronics were glitching more frequently. One elf stopped mid-sentence during its automated Merry Christmas routine and began repeating the word Merry over and over in a distorted, grating voice. Another elf's hands twitched violently, snapping the fake teddy bear it held in two. Visitors started to notice. A little girl screamed when an animatronic turned its head too far, the joint cracking unnaturally as it stared directly at her. Elizabeth approached Tony again. "We need to shut this place down for the night. Something's seriously wrong." "You're overreacting," Tony said, though his voice wavered. "It's just old tech. Happens every year." But Elizabeth wasn't convinced. That night, after the last visitor had left and the doors were locked, Elizabeth stayed behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening, and she needed answers. She crept through the darkened workshop, the only light coming from the faint glow of the animatronics. They stood silently now, their glassy eyes unblinking. As she passed Santa's throne, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a trail of dark stains leading behind it. Her stomach churned, but she followed the trail to the back of the display, where a trapdoor was hidden beneath a rug. Elizabeth hesitated. She had never seen the trapdoor before. None of the staff had ever mentioned it, and it wasn't on the blueprints of the building. Summoning her courage, she lifted the hatch. A cold, foul-smelling draft hit her face. Below, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. Elizabeth grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to guide her as she climbed down. The air grew colder and heavier the deeper she went, and the walls of the passage were damp with something that smelled metallic. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cavernous room lit by faint, flickering candles. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat rows of small jars. Inside the jars were tiny, shriveled bodies, doll-like creatures with twisted limbs and grotesque faces. Elves. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, knocking over one of the jars. It shattered on the ground, and the thing inside twitched violently before going still. The sound echoed through the chamber, and suddenly Elizabeth heard a faint rustling behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam landing on a figure hunched in the shadows. "Mr. Hargrove?" The figure stepped forward, and Elizabeth gasped. It was Hargrove, but he was different. His eyes glowed faintly, his skin pale and waxy, like the animatronics upstairs. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing jagged teeth. "They're waking up," he said, his voice hollow. "And they're hungry." Before Elizabeth could respond, something moved in the darkness. The jars began to rattle, their contents writhing and clawing at the glass. One by one, the lids popped off, and the tiny, twisted elves spilled onto the floor. Elizabeth ran, her heart pounding as the creatures swarmed around her. They were fast, scuttling on all fours with unsettling speed. Their high-pitched giggles echoed through the chamber, growing louder and more frenzied. She reached the stairs and scrambled up, slamming the trapdoor shut behind her. The giggling continued, muffled now, but she knew it wouldn't hold them for long. Elizabeth sprinted through the workshop, heading for the exit. But as she reached the main floor, the animatronics began to move. Their glass eyes turned toward her, and their mouths opened in unison, releasing a deafening, mechanical scream. Elizabeth ducked as one of the elves lunged at her, its metal joints creaking as it swung its hammer. She grabbed a nearby candy cane decoration and used it to knock the animatronic aside, but more were closing in. She bolted for the gift shop, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her chest heaved as she scanned the room for anything she could use as a weapon. The giggling returned, louder now, coming from all around her. Elizabeth turned toward the display shelves, just as one of the tiny elves crawled out from behind a stuffed bear. It grinned at her, its needle-like teeth dripping with saliva. Before she could react, it leapt at her face. She screamed, grabbing it by the torso and slamming it against the wall. It screeched, clawing at her arms, but she managed to hurl it across the room. It hit the ground with a sickening crunch and went still. But more were coming. Elizabeth fought her way through the workshop, dodging animatronics and stomping on the tiny elves whenever they got too close. Her body ached, and her arms were covered in scratches, but she refused to stop. Finally, she reached the main power switch near the back of the building. "This ends now," she muttered, yanking the lever. The lights flickered, and the workshop fell silent. The animatronics froze mid-motion, their lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. For a moment, Elizabeth thought it was over. But then, from somewhere deep below, she heard a voice. "You can't stop us," it whispered, cold and venomous. "We're part of Christmas now." And from the shadows, the giggling began again. Elizabeth fled into the snow, the sound of laughter following her into the dark night. Behind her, the lights of the enchanted workshop flickered back to life, glowing brighter than ever before. In the days that followed, the people of Snowpike searched for Elizabeth, but she was never found. The workshop remained open, its attractions seemingly back to normal. Tourists continued to flock there, delighting in the cheerful animatronics and festive atmosphere. But sometimes, late at night, if you stand close enough, you can hear them. The faint, high-pitched giggles of the elves below, waiting for their next feast.